How do you get good feedback on your Chinese writing using AI? What's the best input method for students? And how do you find interesting topics to write about? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This week's episode is a student Q&A focusing on writing in Chinese. This is set to coincide with the July Writing Challenge, so if you want to know more about that, you can check that link in the show notes. As usual, these challenges are completely free to join. They start on the 10th each month and then run until the end of the month. Regardless when you are listening to this, you can always head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com to see what challenge is on when you are listening. In July 2025, the topic is writing, so that's why I have selected 3 student questions about writing in Chinese that I will try to answer in this episode. So the first question is about how to get good feedback on your Chinese writing using AI. The second question is about which input method is best for writing in Chinese for students. And the third question is about how to find interesting topics when you don't know what to write about. So let's dive straight into question 1 about AI feedback, and this question is from Rosalind. And I would say that getting feedback on your writing is one of the things that AI does pretty well. Large language models are, after all, statistical models based on huge amounts of language data, and so finding patterns in language or deviations from patterns in language, if you make mistakes as a second language learner, is something that they are very good at. You could, of course, just give a text you've written to the AI and ask it for feedback, and you will probably get something useful out of it. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. In general, you can rely on the feedback you get from AI. It is very rarely wrong, at least if we're talking about beginner and intermediate writing. For example, if you use a verb and then use an object with that verb that is inappropriate, this is something the language model is likely to pick up, and it's also likely to be correct. When it comes to more advanced usage and finer nuances, maybe there's more to say about this topic, but when it comes to identifying and fixing basic errors, large language models do very well. There are 2 areas I think worth exploring here, and I will just scratch the surface of what could be said about this because this is a short Q&A episode, but we might return to these topics later. So the first area is how you get the feedback. How can you get the best and the most feedback out of the AI? And the second question is more about practical matters, so how can you work with the AI to learn as much as possible? So let's start with the first area, i.e. getting a lot of good feedback out of the AI. And the best way to do this is to do it sequentially. So you home in on one specific aspect you want to improve, you do that until the AI doesn't have anything useful to say, and then you switch focus to something else. In other words, if you just paste your text and ask the AI to give you feedback on everything, or you don't even specify what you want feedback on, this will give you a very scattered result that can improve your text, but isn't as good as it could be. It's much better then to focus on something very specific. So for example, you can ask it about the structure of your text first and see if there are any improvements you can do there. And then you can ask it about sentence structure, say grammar and things like that, word order. And then you can ask about vocabulary usage and so on. So you are more specific than just merely asking for feedback in general. You want feedback with something specific. This will give you more feedback from the AI, generally speaking, and it's also more productive to work with a specific aspect one at a time, rather than trying to do everything at once. I would suggest an approach where you start with the big things first, roughly as I just mentioned. You start with the overall structure, the topic, etc., and then you home in on smaller things, sentences for example, and then at the very end you look at specific sentences and words, are they used correctly, and so on. So getting useful feedback from a chatbot is not very hard. You can basically just do what I just said and it will work pretty well. But producing a text in Chinese without errors is not actually the goal of most language students. The goal is, after all, to learn to write so you could write that text on your own. That's the goal. We are after the learning, the process, not the end result, the text itself. Imagine in 2 years when you look back at the writing exercise you're doing now and you ask yourself, what was the purpose of this writing exercise? Well, the point is clearly not to produce a good text. Nobody cares if your text is good, and you don't care about it either. Well, maybe you might have cared a little bit if it was part of a, say, graded assignment in a course, because the grade itself might be important, but I think we can agree on that the purpose of writing, in this case, is to improve your ability to write. It is not to produce good texts. This means that how you handle the feedback is at least as important as the feedback itself. We can imagine a situation where getting feedback is literally useless for learning. So you write your text, you give it to the AI, it fixes it for you, and you then submit it. Let's say it is an assignment, and you submit it to your teacher and you get a grade. That's great, but you didn't even read the final version, and so this has zero impact on your Chinese ability. It didn't teach you anything at all. This is a product-oriented approach where the text itself is the main point, but as I said earlier, this isn't what you're after when you're learning Chinese. You don't care about the text itself, you actually just, long-term at least, care about how much you learn. This means that you need to switch to a process-oriented approach where what you do with the text, what you think about, how you process it is the important thing. It's not the final product. So with this approach, it's clear that finishing your first draft is just the first step, and then when you get feedback from the AI, again preferably on one specific area, such as the structure, your vocabulary usage, or something else, you then need to work on the text based on the feedback that you receive. You just don't click OK and let the AI change everything for you. This means that to get to the final version, you need to go through several iterations of feedback, several rounds where you ask the AI for feedback in one area and you then work on that area in your text. The end result, if you do this a few times, is likely to actually be worse than if you just ask the AI to fix everything the first time around. But as we've said, the point is not to produce a good text, the point is to learn, and then you do need to process the feedback. You need to work with your text. A good analogy here might be learning to cook, and using AI to just produce a final text and be done with it is akin to just ordering food. You don't even need to cook, you just skip that step. But the problem is that even if you order food 1,000 times, you will still learn nothing about actually cooking. If you, on the other hand, cook yourself, you get feedback, maybe from people who eat the food, or you watch YouTube videos about how to cook properly, or you cook with other people who are better than you at it, then you will learn, and after having done this 100 times, you will know a lot about cooking. Certainly much more than if you had just ordered takeaway the whole time. So using AI to write for you is then akin to ordering takeaway, whereas using AI to work with your text is more akin to having someone who helps you learn how to cook. This is something I've written more about in an article on Hacking Chinese called Improving Your Spoken and Written Chinese by Focusing on the Process, and as usual I'll put links in the show notes. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to highlight a very useful feature in ChatGPT called Canvas, which allows you to focus on a specific piece of content outside the dialogue form of a normal chatbot. This means that you have the text you're working on in front of you, you can ask questions about it, ask for feedback and so on, but you don't need to scroll up and down in the chat log to find the last version of the text and so on. Okay, I think that means we're ready to move on to question number 2, which is about input methods and which is the best input method for students. This is actually something we've covered before on the podcast, namely in episode 36, Chinese Input Methods, a guide for second language learners. This is an often neglected topic. I mean, yes, people do ask questions about how to enable Chinese on your computer, and there are lots of discussions among native speakers, for example, about which input method is the fastest and so on. It's much rarer to hear a discussion about which method makes sense for you as a student to use, given that you are not just after typing Chinese, you're also after learning things in the process, a little bit like we talked about writing in the previous question. The goal is simply not to input characters, it's to do so in a way that is also helpful. There are basically 4 different categories of input methods. The first is phonetic typing, so that's when you type how things are pronounced, and this is by far the most common way to input characters, both among native speakers and second language learners. This includes typing in pinyin or using 注音符号 or some other kind of phonetic typing. This is good because it's relatively fast and it also allows you to review or make sure you know how to spell things in pinyin, and that also creates a connection between the spoken language and the written language. However, as we all know, just being able to type doesn't necessarily mean you can write the characters by hand, and so if that is a goal, you might want to consider other methods as well. The second category is non-phonetic typing, so now you're not typing pronunciation, but rather the components or parts of the characters, and you kind of compose a character out of different parts. For example, we have Cangjie and Wu Bi, which are both fairly popular. I mean, popular as far as it goes. These methods are rarely used because most people still use phonetic typing, of course. These methods can be useful for Chinese learners, but the learning curve is rather steep, and I have a suspicion that you're just better off focusing on learning more characters or more about characters than learning to use these methods. Then we have handwriting, which of course, if it's an input method, you have to do on some type of screen that then recognizes the characters that you write. And if your goal is to be able to write characters by hand, this is very powerful because you're essentially doing exactly what you would on paper, albeit the computer is probably better at recognizing your characters than a human would be. The problem is that this is painfully slow compared to typing, so if you want to write a longer essay or story or article, this will take you much longer and it's quite frustrating unless your handwriting is already very good. My suggestion, if you care about handwriting, is to set a specific amount of time or maybe a number of characters that you will write by hand every time you start, say, a new writing exercise. You could, for example, spend the first 5 minutes of writing an email by using the handwritten input method, and then after that you change to normal typing. This means that you get plenty of writing practice by hand, but that you don't get stuck forever writing a simple email. The final type of input is speech recognition, so you're not typing sounds, you're just saying them, and your phone or computer will recognize what you say and transcribe it into Chinese characters. This has several benefits. It allows you to make sure your pronunciation is reasonably accurate, otherwise the voice assistant or software won't recognize what you say. You can also write while actually having your hands free or while walking around outside. I use this quite a lot, not because I think it's a great way for me to improve my speaking ability, but simply because it's very practical, and so dictating something is a good option. So to answer the question which method is best, it depends on what you're after. If we by writing mean composition, as in how to construct a text, choose the right words, etc., rather than the ability to write characters or something like that, I think the best method is simply the most efficient one, and that is probably phonetic typing, which is probably what you're already using. Since it is quite fast, you then have a lot of time to think about how to structure your text, which words to choose, and so on. Whereas if you get stuck with writing individual characters or how to compose this character based on its components, this really focuses more on the individual characters and words rather than the composition of the text. Naturally, if you're after a combination of these two, you can then also use a combination of input methods. Nobody forces you to use only one after all. This brings us to the third question, which is from Ali, who wants to know how to choose a good topic for writing. Ali also mentions that people tell him to just write, but he finds it very difficult and often stares at a blank page for, 15 minutes without actually writing anything. And so choosing a topic seems, on the one hand, to be not important at all. You can, after all, write about anything. But on the other hand, if you don't have an interesting topic to write about, it's also hard to get started. I should mention, though, that even if you have something interesting to write about, writer's block is still a thing, and that is unrelated to language learning. And I'm not going to talk about that too much here, and there are plenty of articles dealing with writer's block. So let's focus on writing for language learning purposes here. Naturally, when selecting a topic to write about, your level matters greatly. So beginners should start simple and personal. You can start by journaling or writing a diary, just talking about your everyday life, what you're doing, what you think about it, and so on. This essentially provides you with an endless amount of topics, and it is things you should be able to write about as well, even at a beginner level. If something very complex happens to you, maybe at work, naturally you don't write about that, you focus on the everyday stuff that you have the language to talk about. This is also good because it builds a writing habit that can serve you well as an intermediate and advanced student as well. As you learn more Chinese, you can expand beyond your personal sphere and talk about news maybe, other things that have happened recently, things going on in your community, and so on. At an advanced level, there is really no limit to what you can write, but as Ali has pointed out here, just because you can write about something doesn't mean that you actually will, and staring at a blank page can happen to you at any level. I think the right way to approach this is to realize that choosing a good topic is actually quite important. It doesn't help that your teacher says you can write about anything you want, because if you can't come up with anything to write about, you might get blocked and not even get started. A general strategy that works on all levels and that is also very useful for other reasons is to write about things you have either listened to or read recently. So this could be a chapter in your textbook, a podcast, a book, a news article, or anything you've consumed in Chinese. Writing a summary, including some of your own thoughts, etc., is a great way to consolidate what you've learned. For example, then when you write a summary, you are encouraged to use the language that you encountered when you read or listened to this piece. And that is a great way of activating the vocabulary, making it your own, and remembering it long term. Another strategy you can employ at any level is to use communicative writing. So write with a specific audience in mind, and sure, this could be the entire internet if you put it in a blog or social media, but I suggest that you're more specific than that. For example, chatting is a great way to write in Chinese. I mean, if you're chatting with a specific person, it's engaging, it's communicative, and quite interesting. We actually did talk about chatting as a way of learning Chinese in episode 177, so check that out if you're interested. I know it can be argued that writing is a form of communication regardless who reads it, but if we're looking at a classic writing assignment in school, I think it matters a lot if you know that only your teacher is going to read something, or maybe you don't even know if anybody's going to read it, compared to if you have a specific person in mind and you want to convey something to them, and you also maybe care about what they write in response. Finally, there are lots of online resources with great writing topics. It could be things like 100 interesting questions or just a list of interesting writing topics, not necessarily for language learning purposes, but just things that people find interesting to write about. I'm not going to read through these resources here in the podcast, but I will provide a few links in the show notes if you want lists of interesting topics. That means we have covered the 3 questions about writing ability in Chinese, so the only thing that remains is to wish you good luck with the writing challenge, and I hope to see you there. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.